Well, we'd like to welcome everybody to another BYU Library Family History Center Sunday afternoon webinar or class or whatever you want to call this presentation. Just remind everyone that these classes are recorded and up online on the BYU Library Family History Center website and the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel. So we have two places where these are available. We're going to talk about newspapers, and we've talked about newspapers. I have for many times, but I've always find it something that I have to go back to because either there's a new group of people that don't understand it, or because everybody seems to have some sort of general amnesia on the product of what's happening with newspapers. And when I suggest searching in newspapers, this is kind of the automatic reaction again. And they say, oh, yes, I should do that sometime. Well, I would suggest that sometime is more than sometime. In other words, I would think that it would be a very good idea to start checking newspapers regularly, especially for research done during the time newspapers were published, which means back to about 1600 or so. So that is probably a good idea. And understand that digital newspapers, those newspapers which are even more of them all the time online, are a tremendous source of information. But I just find that they're just not well used. In other words, when I go in and look at someone asks me a question, for example, and I look at Family Search and I look at the sources that they have for the person they're questioning, I almost never see newspapers cited as a source. And that's too bad because the information that they're looking for may very well have been in a newspaper all along. And sometimes I think people only consider using, or they go to newspapers as kind of a last ditch attempt at breaking a brick wall or whatever, end of line or whatever you want to call it. So that's just, this is the impression. And the reason why I'm going to talk about newspapers today is to help you understand that they are just one of the routine places you look for information about individuals and families. It's not something that you go to last, or something that, oh, you do that if you really can't find anything or whatever it is, because they're basically going to provide the information that you need to do really good research. And another question that just boggles my mind is that people ask, well, when do they have the obituaries? And my answer is, they have the obituaries. They also have the sports section. They also have the news section. They also have the money section. In other words, they don't cut out anything when they do digitize the newspapers. They digitize the entire publication, and obituaries are one, or death notices are one of those things that they have in the newspapers. So here's kind of the question of the day, and that is, when was the last time you read a paper copy of a newspaper? Now, I don't mean the throwaway stuff they stuff on your driveway or in your mailbox from some kind of local commercial slash local news place. I'm talking about a newspaper that has, some substance to it, and maybe even a national newspaper. Well, that's kind of the question of the day, because the newspapers that are still viable and are still operable in the digital world have a digital online presence. And so if I want to read newspapers about Arizona, for example, where my wife and I and our family lived for most of our lives, I can read all the local news in Arizona right on my phone or on my iPad or whatever I'm using to read different things online. And this is the existing situation, and that is that currently the media about digital newspapers is dominated by huge online digital databases. Okay, so what does this sentence mean? It means that when you're looking online for newspaper information, you're going to find newspapers.com first. And you may find some other big databases with newspapers also. And you can get the impression that that's all there is. In other words, if you want a digital newspaper, you've got to go to newspapers.com or newspaper whatever on one of the big genealogical group things that are aimed at genealogists. And so they're the things that come up when you do research. So the answer is very simple. They do not have everything. Most of the information they have, especially in the United States, and I'm going to kind of confine my focus here to the United States, but it applies to all the other countries of the world where there are published newspapers. But what is happening today is that they are putting all of what we would call public domain. That means information which is after 1927 in the United States that's passed into the public domain. They cannot maintain any rights to it. They can't keep people from looking at it. Technically, they can't. There's no penalty for copying it or anything, because any public domain things cannot just simply by somebody putting a copyright notice on it can be made into a copyright. Now, why could I say that? Well, I've spent 39 years as a trial attorney and a considerable amount of that time working in addressing problems, not as my major issue, but as part of what I did as a trial attorney with issues that affected intellectual property. So that's something that I've been aware of now for a long time. And that's is my opinion as a person with experience. But the law is that public domain sources cannot be made copyright protected simply by copying them and putting a copyright notice on them. That isn't the way it works. So before you spend your money on a subscription, you just might want to listen to the rest of this presentation. And that's exactly what I think that needs to happen. And I'm going to go back and get some background here. That's the kind of thing I do, is put everything into a context of historical context from the perspective of a genealogical researcher. I could say historical researcher, or I could say any kind of other researcher who was looking for information about people as they lived their daily lives going back in time, sociologists and all sorts of other people. The first newspaper in the American colonies was Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, and was published in 1690. And so we're talking about a lot of newspaper have come out since this particular time. Now, the first newspaper that had a continuously published history is the Boston Newsletter, and it was a single sheet printed on both sides, and it is the first continuously published newspaper in America. So we have quite a number of years back that we can look for newspaper information, particularly in of course, the European portion of the United States, that there's newspapers. And from their very inception, they were a daily part of American life, and also elsewhere around the world. Everybody been reading newspaper. If I think of my grandfather on my mother's side, my maternal grandfather, when I visualize him sitting in his chair in the living room reading the newspaper. And it also was the fact that he was a newspaperman. He had been a publisher of newspapers, and he had been an editor of newspapers during his entire life. And estimates suggest that there have been around 24,000 newspapers published in the United States and the prior colonies. So there's 24,000 different newspapers. spread across 50 states and some of the uh, territories and other things. Okay, so where are they? Are they all sitting on newspapers.com? The answer is no to that. That's simple answer. Are they on one of the other large newspaper websites? The answer is no to that. The fact that these people can make money having the newspapers is that they can negotiate agreements with the publishers, the original publishers of the paper, that have, as I was discussing before we got going here today, a tenuous claim to copyright protections in a lot of different ways. And all I can say is that if you took one edition of a newspaper, one of those folded newspaper editions, and then you started to analyze the copyright issues on that particular one edition, you would basically be stepping off into a rather complex, let's call it black hole, where there may not be any legal answers to some of the questions you could ask. So, do we disregard the copyright? The answer is no, we can't. But do we become a little bit educated about copyright? Yes, we do. And we can do that by going to copyright.gov. How about that for a website? It's part of the Library of Congress, and it's been in the news lately. And here's the question. Do the large websites own all their digital newspapers? And I use the word own to mean, do they have the copyright interest in it? Do they have the right to tell you you can't look at it unless they give you permission or unless you pay them a certain amount of money? And the answer is, with regards to the word all, is no. They do not have copyright protection to all their digital newspapers. They only have those copyright protections that are actually under copyright and that they have the right to maintain or enforce that copyright. And so here's this long statement that a portion of their inventory consists of newspapers that are in the public domain, meaning they're no longer protected by copyright. To access more recent newspapers still under copyright, these large websites have established licensing agreements with publishers, which is reflected in their Publisher Extra subscription. So sometimes you can look on them and find things that are not covered by copyright, and sometimes you have to pay to look at additional. So under the U.S. copyright law, works published in 1929 enter the public domain in 2025. And this is something that comes out in the news every year as the years passed. The copyright law moves forward, and more and more works are available without any kind of claim or copyright claim. And once again, which I've said just moments ago, you can't claim a copyright to works in the public domain. So once it's in the public domain, it's searchable, it's yours to look at. You can copy it, you can put it in your presentations or in your memories or wherever you want to put it without anybody worrying about it. And by the way, since in genealogy, we're only getting going on getting names and doing research at about 1920 in many cases, then we've left copyright issues way back in our dusty past of where we've been doing research. And then if you're doing descendancy research, of course, then you go back into let's call it the copyright wall. So I'm going to take it from this standpoint. I'm going to say, let's ignore all of the larger websites with a paywall. So if you're looking online and they say, if you want to read this article, you've got to subscribe, then I'm not going to talk about it right now. I'm through with those. I'm not going to go hash through all of those big paywall websites again. I would guess you start looking for newspapers online, you're going to find them all in a very short time with a Google search. Okay, but we are going to start with one of the basic ones that is not a paywall, that is completely free, and that is the Library of Congress, LOC, and LOC.gov digital collections chronicling America, historic American newspapers. And this is the website that has currently a huge number of collections, millions and millions and millions of pages of newspapers. They're completely searchable, word for word. They are totally free, and anything you find you can use in just about any way you really want to get into it. So first of all, here's a search, and it's a little bit complex. You can think about it. You may have to think about how you want it to be searched. As I mentioned just a moment ago, my maternal grandfather, his name was Harold Morgan. He lived in Arizona, as did all four of my grandparents. And he lived in Apache County, which was where all four of my grandparents lived. So I usually find that using my grandparents or my great grandparents or my great 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 grandparents or whatever as examples is helpful because I'm not surprised. So because I know what I'm probably going to find. Okay, so if I do this search, this is just chronicling America, Library of Congress. Then I get here and I have the results 115 pages. Now, perhaps not all these pages are my grandfather, except everything visible here happens to be my grandfather. And the newspaper titles that they came from was the St. John's Herald, which was published between 1917 and 1938, and the St. John's Herald and Apache News, which was published between 1905 and 1917. So this is a newspaper that we have copies online from 1905 through 1938. And that pretty well covers the lifespan, not all of the lifespan, but the major part of the growing up and going to school span of my four grandparents. So I should be able to find quite a few, and I did, right here, articles about with my grandfather mentioned. And I could do this with anybody else that I was related to in the town where these people lived. Now, the St. John's Herald was published in this community. The town is St. John's, Arizona. And so this is where, and it's in Apache County, and was in Apache County the entire time since its beginning. And so this is the kind of blow up of what it showed. It said there's 115 pages available online. It can display the whole thing. It has out of 56 issues of the newspaper and 59 pages of full text search. So it's a newspaper and it's all the dates and places and everything of the newspaper. Now, what are you finding when you get into the newspaper? Well, let's look at something in a different newspaper, and this is the Holbrook News, which Holbrook is in Navajo County, the county next to Apache County. Now, here this kind of raises a fundamental issue with small newspapers, small town newspapers, as they existed across the United States during this, I'd call this the heyday of newspapers from around 1800 to about 1950, 1960. So newspapers were the big thing, but they needed news. And if you were living in a county like Apache County, Arizona, say back in 1912 or whenever, then you're going to run out of news pretty quick because everybody kind of does the same things every day. And unless somebody breaks a leg or loses a cow or gets in a fight or something happens to it's reportable, you're going to have to go someplace else for news. So basically, these newspapers would gather news from the region and sometimes the state, and sometimes they would even incorporate international news as in a sense, a space filler to fill up space on the newspaper because it was helpful. People would get more interest if they had access to some of this. But on the other hand, the real interest was in what was going on in the town. And so this is well, another kind of note. When I and my siblings were younger, we used to read the newspapers, the local newspapers from around eastern Utah. And they were the most entertaining things that we could find. I mean, they were usually we were laughing so hard because of what they were saying. But you may find the same thing when you get into it. But let's look at this a little bit closer here so you can see what's happening here with this item. So this happens to be a play that was put on in Taylor, Arizona, and it was called Little Miss Nobody. And it was a comedy, and then they get down it, and then they start to tell you who the people were that they noticed came from out of town to visit or were there, and they just happened to mention them. So there they are, and there's the Tanner family people all of a sudden, who also came from Arizona. That's my paternal line. And so basically, within a matter of a few seconds here on the Library of Congress website, I have found specific articles about my specific ancestors. Now, as they say, your results may vary depending on when, where, and where your people were, and how involved were they in the community, and what other kinds of things might have been happening at the time. But in this case, it's right there. And if we go back to the St. John's Herald in Apache County, then we can see that this says Mr. and Mrs. Marinus Christensen, who accompanied their son Joseph to Salt Lake City some weeks ago, returned to St. John's last Friday. They report that a splendid visit with their daughter, Mrs. Harold Morgan, and Mr. Christensen says while they were visited, they went to the Deseret News plant and went through the plant with Harold Morgan, who is Mrs. Harold Morgan's husband, who happens to be Jesse Christensen Morgan. And so this is my great grandfather, Marinus Christensen, with his son, meaning my uncle, Joe Christensen, visiting my grandfather, Harold Morgan, and my grandmother, Jesse Christensen Morgan, and also going to the occupational workplace of my grandfather, Harold Morgan. So what have I learned here? I've learned my grandfather worked for the newspaper. I've learned more information about 4 different families, one whole set of families, including Joseph and Marinus and Jesse and Harold. Okay, and that's all in this one little newspaper account. And this may be a breakthrough for somebody. It could be. And you may find something similar like this that tells all these relationships, and all of a sudden you are on the way to doing some more research. Question, is it reliable? Well, maybe. But in this case, why not? I mean, what are they going to get wrong about this? Well, they could have gotten it wrong. Perhaps Mrs. Harold Morgan was not their daughter. It was somebody else, a relationship. But that's the kind of thing we deal with when we're doing research, and that is we find other sources that collaborated. But to skip over something like this that gives you this much information about somebody and an occupation, which becomes extremely helpful when you're looking on the census records and where they list the occupation, and that helps you to separate other people with the same name. So here you are with quite a bit of information. Now let's skip over to Google. Google some time ago decided to collect all the newspapers. They quickly ran into the issue of getting too big and with other companies like newspapers.com, and they were kind of clunked into each other. But Google's ended up with a huge collection of newspapers. Here they are from various countries. These appear to be all in French. Not all. There's a couple of them down there that aren't, but there's a lot of them in French. But there's a lot of information in this website. And these are fully searchable, free records. Then we're going to turn to Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia has a huge list of newspapers online, starting with Afghanistan and moving all the way through countries. And all of these may or may not be, but they're marked free if they are free, which means that this is as a tremendous list of newspapers across the world that are free. I don't know how up to date it is. I would think that at some points you might find that the links don't work so well. But on the other hand, since it's Wikipedia, it's probably being kept up to some extent. And if there is a broken link, that something has been done to correct that. So you can see here a limited number of complementary accounts for the for-profit databases. Newspapers.com and Newspaper Archive are available to Wikipedians through the Wikipedia library. So the complementary accounts mean free accounts. The free newspapers of newspapers.com and Newspaper Archive are available through Wikipedia. Well, that's not the only way they're available. There's other ways to access those free parts of those newspapers. So this list is basically both a listing free and what I call paywall or pay subscription type websites where you have to have a subscription in order to continue doing research on the website. So it's just a matter of fact. And this is kind of, now you may have a little more perspective from what I've said, that there's going to be a lot of free newspapers, and then there's going to be a lot of newspapers behind a paywall. But you may find what you need to find out of the free newspapers. And I would certainly, as I mentioned before you put any money into the paywall programs, at least do a fairly extensive search on the free sites. This is in England, Great Britain. Find My Past, and it has, in partnership with Find My Past, has a complete list of our free to view newspaper pages. So this is where you could go in England to find that information. Now, here's another interesting part of all of this. Years ago, the Library of Congress began their national digital newspaper program. They started digitizing newspapers and putting them on their website, on the loc.gov website. But in order to get other newspapers available and across the entire United States, the Library of Congress gave grants to the National Endowment for the Humanities to people through that, to newspapers, to the states, to create digital newspaper websites. So guess what? All the green states on that map on the right-hand side of the page are all the states and places where they were successful. They actually created a local newspaper in each state. So you have Alaska, Arizona, Utah, California, Nevada, etc. And I could go on across the country, but every state has some form of a free digital newspaper website. So just go online, look for free digital newspapers, This is a search on Google search. Save the Google News art site, Chronicling America, free online newspaper archives, Utah digital newspapers, Missouri digital newspapers, newspapers. This is just, and this would be pages and pages of websites with free digital newspapers. So this is the National Digital Newspaper Program. And this in Library of Congress is the page of the Library of Congress website that has all of that information about each of the states' involvement and which years they were involved with Library of Congress. That doesn't mean anything about the collections they have or they don't have. Some states, like Utah, where I live now, have huge collections of local newspapers that are free, totally accessible. They were in conjunction with the University of Utah. You'll find the same or similar things in other states. There may or may not be more or fewer newspapers listed, but there's going to be a collection for each place. As you see down the bottom, toward the bottom, is Idaho State Historical Society was the one who collected newspapers. And then Georgia, the state of Georgia, Digital Library of Georgia, the University of Georgia Libraries did that. And then in Florida, the University of Florida at Gainesville did their newspaper. So there's a variety of organizations that agreed to get involved with grants to digitize and make available newspapers. So there's the list. So let's look at Utah example. I'm only taking that because that's where I live, and so I just decided I'd look at Utah. But I do this because I've been using the Utah Digital Newspapers website for quite a few years now, and it is extremely good. And the number of articles and the response is extraordinarily good. So let's look up another search. In this case, I'm going to look up the same person, Harold Morgan, my grandfather, maternal grandfather. And there's a check. I'm searching all the newspapers. And here I find an article in the Nephi News, 1933 to 1910. And I mean, in October of 19th of 1933. And we're on page 4, and it says Sunday guests of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Linton were Mr. and Mrs. Harold Morgan and Mrs. Mary Morgan of Salt Lake City. So once again, we have what seems to be a mention of a family. It turns out that Mary Morgan of Salt Lake City, who is my great-grandmother, is the mother of Harold Morgan, my grandfather. But the question about Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Linton is ambiguous because Samuel Linton was Mary Morgan's father, and that's probably, she could have still be living, and that might be a question. But she has a brother also named Samuel Linton. So it may have been a visit to a brother. But what does this do for genealogy? It establishes people's identity in a place at a specific period of time. So we know that there was somebody named Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Linton who were related to Mary Morgan and Harold Morgan in some fashion at the date of this in 1933. So that may be some key to understanding this particular family and their relationships. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for me, this is stuff that I already know. In other words, I'm doing this examples from information that I know is reliable because I've done the research previously. But if you're getting into this on the first hand, if this is the first time you've started to get into this kind of information on newspapers, you may be tremendously surprised to see how the relationships come out and where the people were and who they were and what they did for a living and what they ate for dinner. and who they had come and visit, and all the other things that happen as you get into newspaper. So now we're going to jump. Let's just jump over to one that's a little bit different. This is the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records. And bear in mind, I'm using these as examples. I mean, you could pick any other state. You could start with Maine and go to Florida, to Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, any of the states. You're always going to find some information at that level that is free and that is available online. That's the nature of the digital newspaper project. So here we are in Missouri, and excuse me, in Arizona, and we're looking at the Arizona Memory Project, and they have the Arizona Historical Digital Newspapers. And they have a lot of information, and here's the start of their collections. And you would basically start searching and finding the newspapers. So it's just that simple. You go straight to the state by searching for digital newspapers in Arizona, and it'll come up with the Arizona Memory Project. So here's some more, just so you'll understand the breadth of all this. This is Ohio. Now, this illustrates a different and something that I started a little bit of referred to just a few minutes ago, and that is that these newspapers had to trade off on their content. In other words, if one of the counties here in Ohio published a story that was kind of newsworthy, let's say, something that out of the ordinary happened in the county, then that article would probably be picked up by a number of other counties looking for news. And how did they know that? Well, because they all subscribed to everybody else's newspapers. So every day they got the new newspapers, they went through them to see what kind of news they could pull out, plus whatever their reporters and other people, news gathering people, could provide with them for that day. And then that was incorporated in their newspaper. Were they very fast about it? Meh, not necessarily. You might find articles printed weeks, even months after some types of issues. To give you an idea of the distance, my great great grandfather, Sidney Tanner, who lived in Beaver, Utah, which is in the southern portion of Utah, when he died, his obituary appeared in the Ogden Examiner, which is in Ogden, Utah, about 250 or so miles to the north through a lot of different counties. So it's possible that, and this is kind of the challenge, is you may have spots of newspapers from all those different counties in Ohio. And in order to be assured that you have searched, you need to go and make sure that you have searched every single one of those. So this is not a game that is difficult. But if there's a search engine and it's online and they have a catalog, then you can usually narrow down your search. But if your person came from Marion County, Ohio, or from Fulton County, Ohio, or wherever, and you think you've looked in that newspaper and that's all there is to it, I would suggest that you've just barely started your search in the newspaper business, because you're basically going to be looking across the state in every states you can, and even across state lines, articles that had extraordinary interest, really ridiculous things happening, basically would end up migrating across the country. Here's Washington digital newspapers in Washington state. And you can browse by title, date, and subjects. And there are over 600,000 pages of the Washington's earliest territorial newspapers to the present day. And it's growing. and they have a physical collection, meaning paper newspapers of 6,500 paper newspapers. So as time passes and as more of this stuff gets digitized, there's still going to be more digitized. You still may be having to go to a library archive someplace in the country and dig through actual newspapers, the paper, which I have done in the past and which I have not done for a very long time. So this is the way it's freely accessible to the public. That's the magic words that we want to hear about. Just so you don't feel bad over there on the East Coast, we go to North Carolina newspapers. Same thing here. There are a huge number of titles of newspapers that are available. In this case, there are 30,000 images, 50,000 plus files, and city directories, and other interesting things. In the newspapers, you've got 608,023 pages and indexed, meaning you can search all of those pages of newspapers in North Carolina. So just suggesting that you might want to take advantage of that in the county and country that you're looking at. Okay, well, my answer here is to keep looking. There is nothing about genealogy that ever comes to a final end as far as information is concerned. There's always seems to be ways to get some more information from someplace. And right now, when we're considering how important it is to understand the context of your families, that newspapers are going to provide context for everything from my grandfather visiting his mother for Thanksgiving dinner to a lot of other things that seem very trivial, but it's the trivial things that make up the fabric of your own family history. So it's best thing to do is to start to understand that there's a lot of information out there in the form of digital newspapers that you can easily obtain. Okay, well, thanks for watching.